I never thought I'd see my daughter-in-law's face drained of all color quite like it did that December evening, standing in her pristine marble foyer, clutching a foreclosure notice with trembling hands. Just hours earlier, she'd told my son I wasn't refined enough for their exclusive Christmas dinner with her business associates. Now she was staring at the signature on legal documents, finally understanding that the woman she'd dismissed as a simple retiree was actually the private investor who held the mortgage on their million-dollar home. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The irony wasn't lost on me that someone who prided herself on thorough research had never bothered to look beyond the surface of the quiet widow living in the modest ranch house across town. My name is Catherine Walsh, and for the past 8 years I've been living what most people would consider two completely separate lives. To my son Michael and his wife Jessica, I'm simply the 68-year-old widow who lost her husband Frank to cancer, someone who clips coupons and drives a 10-year-old Honda Accord. To the financial world, I'm CM Walsh Properties, a private real estate investor whose portfolio includes over 200 properties across 3 states, including luxury homes, commercial buildings and apartment complexes worth more than $40 million. The deception wasn't planned. It evolved naturally from a combination of grief, family expectations, and my own desire to rebuild my identity after Frank's death. When Frank passed away 7 years ago, everyone assumed I'd struggle financially. He'd been a high school principal for 30 years, and I'd worked part-time as a school secretary until our son was born. We lived comfortably but modestly in our small ranch house in Riverside Heights, a middle-class suburb where neighbors knew each other's names and children played in the streets during summer evenings. What nobody knew, not even Frank in his final years, was that I'd been quietly building a real estate investment business for over 2 decades. It started with a small inheritance from my grandmother in 1998, $25,000 that Frank suggested we put toward Michael's college fund. Instead, I invested it in a rundown duplex on the outskirts of town. Frank thought I was being sentimental, wanting to fix up the property where my grandmother had lived before moving to assisted living. He wasn't entirely wrong. I was being sentimental, but I was also being strategic in ways that even I didn't fully understand at the time. That duplex, purchased for $18,000 and renovated for another $7,000 with my own labor during weekends and evenings, became the foundation of everything that followed. I learned to tile bathrooms, install light fixtures, and negotiate with contractors. I discovered I had an eye for properties with hidden potential and a talent for seeing past surface problems to underlying value. The duplex rented quickly, generating enough monthly income to cover its mortgage and provide a small profit. Within 2 years, I'd saved enough to purchase another property, then another. Frank knew about the rental income but assumed it was minimal, just enough to cover property taxes and maintenance. He never asked for detailed financial information, and I never offered it. In the early 2000s, married women managing their own investment portfolios wasn't as common as it is today, and Frank, despite being progressive in many ways, held traditional views about financial management. By the time Michael graduated high school in 2005, I owned 6 rental properties and had begun lending money to other investors for short-term renovation projects. The returns were substantial, often 20% annually, but I maintained our modest lifestyle and continued working part-time at the school. Frank attributed our financial stability to his principal's salary and careful budgeting. I let him believe it because it seemed easier than explaining investment strategies he showed no interest in understanding. The real growth happened after 2008, during the financial crisis that devastated so many families. While banks tightened lending requirements and foreclosures flooded the market, I had accumulated enough capital to purchase distressed properties at significant discounts. I wasn't taking advantage of anyone's misfortune. I was providing solutions. Families facing foreclosure could sell to me quickly, often for enough to pay off their mortgages and avoid bankruptcy. I would renovate the properties and either rent them to stable tenants or sell them to families ready for homeownership. Between 2008 and 2015, my portfolio grew from 6 properties to 43. The income allowed me to hire property management companies, renovation crews, and eventually a small team of employees who handled day-to-day operations while I focused on identifying new opportunities and managing the growing business. I am incorporated as CM Walsh Properties in 2010, using my maiden name initials to maintain privacy. Catherine Marie Walsh became CM Walsh, a designation that appeared on legal documents and business correspondence but revealed nothing about the person behind the company. Frank's illness began in 2016, a diagnosis that changed everything about our family dynamics, while ironically accelerating my business growth. As his health declined, I spent more time working from home, managing investments through phone calls and email while caring for him. Michael, who had moved to Chicago after college and married Jessica 2 years earlier, visited regularly but remained focused on his own career as a software engineer and his wife's ambitions in marketing consulting. During Frank's final months, when medical bills and treatment costs mounted despite our insurance coverage, I quietly liquidated some investments to ensure he received the best possible care. Michael offered to help financially, but I declined, telling him his father's pension and our savings were sufficient. The truth was that I was spending nearly $200,000 on experimental treatments and private specialists, amounts that would have shocked my family had they known the source. Frank passed away in March 2017, surrounded by family and comfortable in his own bed thanks to hospice care. I arranged through connections I'd made in the healthcare real estate sector. The funeral was beautiful, attended by hundreds of former students and colleagues who remembered him as a dedicated educator. Michael delivered a moving eulogy about his father's integrity and service, while I sat in the front pew, grieving genuinely while simultaneously fielding text messages from my property manager about a time-sensitive acquisition opportunity. The month after Frank's funeral marked a turning point in both my business and my relationship with Michael and Jessica. They expected me to struggle with widowhood, to need their guidance and support as I navigated life alone. Instead, I threw myself into work with renewed focus, purchasing 3 properties in April alone, and beginning to explore commercial real estate opportunities. When they offered to help me organize Frank's financial papers, I politely declined, telling them I preferred to handle such personal matters privately. Jessica, who had always been polite but distant during their visits, began making comments about my independence that felt more like criticisms. She worried aloud that I was making hasty decisions and suggested I might benefit from financial counseling. When Michael mentioned that their Chicago mortgage rates seemed high, I offered general advice about refinancing options but didn't reveal that I personally held mortgages on properties throughout their neighborhood through my investment company. The pattern of exclusion began subtly. That first summer after Frank's death, family gatherings became less frequent, with Jessica often citing work commitments or social obligations that prevented them from visiting Riverside Heights. When they did visit, conversations focused on their lives, their careers, their plans, with minimal interest in how I was adjusting to life alone. I didn't mind the lack of attention to my daily activities, but I began to notice how they spoke about me in third person even when I was present, discussing my limitations and needs as if I were incapable of self-determination. By 2018, my portfolio had expanded to include commercial properties, and I was frequently traveling to evaluate potential acquisitions. When Michael asked about my increased travel, I mentioned visiting old friends and exploring new hobbies. The half-truth satisfied their curiosity while protecting the privacy I'd come to value. They seemed relieved that I was staying busy and moving forward positively without requiring their constant support. The first major exclusion happened during Thanksgiving 2018. Michael and Jessica had planned to host dinner at their new home in Oak Ridge Estates, an upscale development north of Chicago, where they'd recently purchased a 4-bedroom colonial with a mortgage I'd actually underwritten through one of my lending partnerships, though they had no idea of my involvement. 3 days before the holiday, Jessica called to explain that her parents had decided to visit unexpectedly from Portland, and their dining room couldn't accommodate everyone comfortably. "We'll do our own celebration the following weekend," she promised, her voice carrying that particular tone of false regret that I'd learned to recognize. Something more intimate, just the 3 of us. That intimate celebration never materialized. Jessica's parents extended their stay. Then Michael had a work crisis. Then the holidays were over and everyone was too busy to reschedule. I spent Thanksgiving alone for the first time in 45 years, but instead of feeling sorry for myself, I flew to Austin to evaluate a potential mixed-use development opportunity. The trip resulted in my largest single investment to date, a 20-unit apartment complex that would anchor my expansion into the Texas market. Christmas followed a similar pattern. Last-minute complications, sincere apologies, promises to make it up to me that somehow never materialized. I began to understand that I was being gradually phased out of their lives, relegated to phone calls and birthday cards while they built a social circle that didn't include Frank's simple widow from the suburbs. The irony was particularly sharp during their 2019 housewarming party, which I learned about through social media posts rather than a direct invitation. Photos showed their beautifully decorated home filled with well-dressed guests, cocktails being served in their spacious living room, Jessica looking radiant as she gave tours of their updated kitchen and master suite. The mortgage payments on that house came directly to my business account every month, but they had no idea that the woman they'd excluded from their celebration was the same person who'd made their homeownership possible. Through 2019 and 2020, my business continued growing while my relationship with Michael and Jessica became increasingly distant. Phone calls became less frequent, visits virtually non-existent. They were busy, successful, building their lives in ways that apparently had no room for an aging mother-in-law from a small town. I understood their perspective, even if it hurt. From their viewpoint, I was a reminder of a simpler past that didn't align with their sophisticated present. What they didn't realize was that their sophisticated present was increasingly built on foundations I'd helped create. The economic uncertainty of 2020 had created opportunities for investors with available capital, and I'd expanded aggressively, purchasing distressed commercial properties and residential developments from owners who needed quick sales. Several of their neighbors, colleagues, and friends had unknowingly borrowed money from my company for renovations, refinancing, or bridge loans while they searched for traditional financing. By early 2021, I owned or held mortgages on nearly 200 properties, including 7 homes in their own neighborhood. My business had grown to require a small staff of property managers, accountants, and legal specialists, all of whom knew me as C.M. Walsh, the shrewd investor who could analyze a deal in minutes and close transactions faster than most banks. None of them would have recognized the quiet woman in comfortable shoes, who occasionally appeared in Michael's social media posts during brief holiday visits. The final exclusion that would change everything happened in November 2021, when Jessica sent a text message rather than calling to explain that they wouldn't be able to accommodate me for Christmas dinner. Her company was hosting an important client dinner that evening, she explained, and Michael's participation was crucial for his career advancement. She hoped I understood that this was a significant professional opportunity that they couldn't decline. I did understand. I understood that I'd become an inconvenience in their carefully curated life, someone whose presence might detract from the image they wanted to project to clients and colleagues. I also understood that the time for maintaining my double life was coming to an end. At 68, I was tired of pretending to be less than I was, tired of accepting exclusion from my own family while quietly managing investments that exceeded their household income by factors they couldn't imagine. As I sat in my modest kitchen that evening, reading Jessica's polite but dismissive text, I made a decision that would alter the course of all our relationships. It was time for Catherine Walsh, the simple widow, and C.M. Walsh Properties, the successful investor, to become the same person. The question wasn't whether to reveal my true financial position, but how to do it in a way that would teach them something valuable about assumptions, respect, and the danger of underestimating people based on superficial observations. Little did I know that events already in motion would provide the perfect opportunity sooner than I'd imagined. Sometimes the universe has a way of creating teachable moments just when they're needed most. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now back to where we left off. The new year brought changes I hadn't anticipated. January 2022 marked not only the beginning of my most ambitious business expansion yet, but also the start of a chain of events that would ultimately force a reckoning with my family that I'd been avoiding for years. It began with a phone call from Marcus Rodriguez, a commercial real estate broker I'd worked with for over a decade. Marcus was one of the few people in my professional life who knew me as Catherine rather than just C.M. Walsh, having started our relationship when I was still a relatively small investor with only a dozen properties. Over the years, he'd become something of a trusted advisor, helping me navigate increasingly complex deals while maintaining the discretion that was essential to my continued privacy. "Catherine," he said that cold Monday morning in January, "I've got something that might interest you. It's big, probably the largest opportunity I've ever brought to your attention, but it requires moving fast." The opportunity was a portfolio sale from Meridian Development Group, a Chicago-based company that had overextended during the pandemic and needed to liquidate assets quickly to avoid bankruptcy. The portfolio included 47 properties across Illinois and Indiana, apartment complexes, office buildings, retail centers, and single-family homes in various stages of development. The asking price was $18 million, but Marcus estimated the actual value at closer to $28 million once renovations were completed and occupancy rates improved. The catch, Marcus explained, is that they need a decision within 2 weeks and closing within 30 days. Most institutional investors can't move that fast through their approval processes. But someone with your resources and decision-making authority could structure this as a private purchase. I spent the next week conducting the most intensive due diligence of my career. Working 18-hour days, I analyzed financial statements, inspected properties, reviewed tenant agreements, and assessed renovation needs. My accountant, Patricia Chen, worked alongside me to structure the financing in a way that would minimize tax implications while maximizing cash flow potential. By Friday, I'd made my decision. I would purchase the entire portfolio. The acquisition required liquidating several existing investments and securing a bridge loan for the balance, but the numbers were compelling. More importantly, the portfolio included properties in some of Chicago's most desirable neighborhoods, including 3 apartment buildings within a mile of Michael and Jessica's home in Oak Ridge Estates. If my calculations were correct, the investment would increase my net worth by approximately $10 million over the next 5 years, while generating substantial monthly cash flow immediately. As I signed the preliminary purchase agreement in Marcus's downtown office that Friday afternoon, I felt a familiar mixture of excitement and solitude that had characterized most of my major business decisions since Frank's death. This was the largest single transaction of my career, a deal that would establish CM Walsh Properties as a significant player in the Chicago real estate market, and I had no one to share the moment with. Michael and Jessica were busy with their own lives, and they would have been shocked to learn that their simple mother-in-law was about to become one of the larger private property owners in their city. The irony deepened the following Monday when Michael called with news of his own. He'd received a promotion to senior software architect at his firm, a position that came with a significant salary increase and stock options. The promotion also meant longer hours and increased responsibility, but he was excited about the career advancement. "We're thinking about upgrading the house," he mentioned during our conversation. "Jessica's been looking at properties in Willowbrook Heights. It's a newer development, larger lots, better schools for when we eventually have kids. The houses are in the $800,000 to $1.2 million range, but with my new salary and Jessica's consulting contracts, we should qualify for financing." Willowbrook Heights was a development I knew well. I'd been tracking its progress for 2 years, watching as luxury homes sold to young professionals and executives seeking prestige addresses outside the city. Several of my business contacts had children living there, and I'd heard consistent reports about the community's appeal to upwardly mobile families. What Michael didn't know was that I'd been considering investing in Willowbrook Heights myself, potentially purchasing several properties for high-end rental income. "That sounds wonderful," I told him, genuinely pleased about his promotion while mentally calculating what their mortgage payments might be on $1 million home. "Have you found a realtor you're comfortable working with?" "Jessica's been working with someone from her networking group," he replied, Amanda Sterling from Sterling & Associates. "She specializes in luxury properties and has connections with private lenders for people in our income bracket." I knew Amanda Sterling by reputation. She was competent but expensive, charging higher commissions than most agents but delivering results for clients with specific requirements. More relevantly, Sterling & Associates frequently worked with investors like me to connect high-income buyers with private financing when traditional banks couldn't accommodate their timelines or unique situations. Over the next month, as I finalized the Meridian portfolio purchase and began implementing renovation plans for the most promising properties, Michael and Jessica's house hunting accelerated. Their weekend calls, when they occurred, were filled with details about open houses, neighborhood amenities, and the competitive nature of the luxury housing market. Jessica had apparently developed strong opinions about architectural styles, school districts, and proximity to shopping centers that met her standards. "We put an offer on a place last weekend," Michael told me during a brief Sunday evening call in February. "It's a new construction colonial in Willowbrook Heights, 5 bedrooms, 3-car garage, finished basement. The asking price was $950,000, but we offered $1.1 million to beat out other bidders." "Congratulations," I said, though something in his tone suggested the story wasn't finished. "Did they accept your offer?" "They did, but there's a complication with financing. Our bank pre-approved us for $800,000 based on my old salary, but the underwriting for the higher amount is taking longer than expected. Amanda suggested we might need to consider private financing to meet the closing deadline, but those interest rates are typically higher than conventional mortgages. I set down the property inspection report I'd been reviewing, my attention now fully focused on Michael's situation. Private financing for luxury home purchases was exactly the type of lending my company had begun offering to qualified borrowers. The interest rates were indeed higher than bank mortgages, typically ranging from 6 to 8% depending on the borrower's financial profile, but the approval process was much faster and more flexible. "How much of a time constraint are you facing?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral despite my growing interest in the situation. "3 weeks to close," Michael replied with obvious stress. "If we can't secure financing by March 15th, we forfeit our earnest money and the house goes to the backup offer." Jessica's devastated because she says it's the perfect house and there's nothing else available in that neighborhood that meets our criteria. The perfect opportunity was presenting itself, though Michael had no idea how perfect it actually was. Through CM Walsh Properties, I could approve his financing application within days and offer terms that, while not as favorable as bank rates, would be competitive with other private lenders. The loan would be secured by the property itself, making it a relatively low-risk investment for my company while solving Michael and Jessica's immediate problem. However, providing the loan would mean revealing my business identity or at least creating a connection between Catherine Walsh and CM Walsh Properties that might raise questions I wasn't ready to answer. I found myself at a crossroads between maintaining my privacy and helping my son achieve his homeownership goals. "Have you researched private lending options?" I asked carefully. "There are reputable companies that specialize in bridge financing for situations like yours." "Amanda's putting together a list of potential lenders," Michael said. "Most of them require extensive documentation and personal guarantees, but she thinks we're good candidates because of our combined income and credit scores." She mentioned one company, CM Walsh Properties, that has a reputation for quick approvals and reasonable terms for qualified borrowers. My heart rate increased as I processed this information. Amanda Sterling was apparently planning to present my own company as a financing option for my son's home purchase. The irony was almost overwhelming. Michael and Jessica might end up borrowing money from the woman they'd excluded from family gatherings without ever knowing the connection. "That's interesting," I managed to say. "What do you know about CM Walsh Properties?" "Not much," Michael admitted. "Amanda says they're a private investment firm that focuses on real estate lending. The owner maintains a low profile, but they've financed several high-end purchases in our area. The interest rates are typically 1 to 2% higher than bank mortgages, but they can close within 2 weeks if everything checks out." I spent the rest of that evening wrestling with the implications of this situation. On one hand, providing financing for Michael's home purchase would be a sound business decision. His income was stable, his credit history was excellent, and the property itself would serve as collateral. On the other hand, the loan would create an ongoing financial relationship that would be difficult to conceal if our family dynamics ever changed. More fundamentally, I had to consider whether helping them financially, while they continued to exclude me socially, was enabling behavior that had already caused significant emotional distance between us. Would secretly facilitating their upgrade to a more expensive home and lifestyle reinforce their assumption that they could ignore me personally while benefiting from my resources indirectly? The decision became more complex when Jessica called me directly 2 days later, something that hadn't happened in over a year. Her voice carried an unusual combination of stress and determination that I'd learned to associate with her professional crisis management mode. "Catherine," she began, using my first name with the formal politeness she reserved for necessary but uncomfortable conversations. "Michael mentioned that you two discussed our housing situation. I wanted to reach out personally because we're facing some time pressure that might affect our ability to visit as frequently over the next few months." "I understand," I replied, though I suspected her call had a purpose beyond updating me on their social calendar. "The thing is," Jessica continued, "we're stretching financially to make this house purchase work. It's an investment in our future, and the neighborhood is perfect for our long-term goals, but it means we'll need to be more careful about discretionary spending for a while. Travel, entertainment, family gatherings. Everything will need to be more budget-conscious until we settle into the new mortgage payments." I recognized this as both an explanation and a preemptive excuse. They were telling me that their housing upgrade would necessitate even less family contact. framing financial pressure as the reason for continued exclusion rather than acknowledging their ongoing pattern of prioritizing their social ambitions over family relationships. "I appreciate you letting me know," I said carefully. "Major purchases always require adjustments to spending priorities." "Exactly," Jessica replied with obvious relief that I was understanding. "I knew you'd get it. You and Frank were always so sensible about money management. Michael learned those values from you, which is why we're being conservative about taking on additional expenses until we're comfortable with the new budget." The comment about Frank and me being sensible with money management stung more than Jessica probably intended. She was essentially saying that our modest lifestyle had taught Michael to be financially responsible, while simultaneously using that responsibility as justification for excluding me from their more affluent social circle. The condescension was subtle but unmistakable. "Will you be working with a particular lender for the financing?" I asked, curiosity overriding my irritation. "Our realtor has some recommendations," Jessica replied. "There's one private lending company that sounds promising, CM Walsh Properties. They apparently specialize in situations like ours where traditional banks can't accommodate the timeline. The rates are higher, but Amanda says the owner is very professional and efficient." "That's good," I said, fighting to keep my voice neutral. "Efficient service is valuable when you're working with tight deadlines." "Absolutely. Amanda's submitting our application tomorrow, and she expects to hear back within a few days. If everything goes smoothly, we could close on schedule and be moved in by early April." After Jessica hung up, I sat in my home office, staring at the financial documents spread across my desk, feeling a strange combination of amusement and sadness. Within 24 hours, I would receive a formal loan application from my son and daughter-in-law, complete with detailed financial statements, employment verification, and credit reports. I would know more about their spending habits, debt obligations, and financial goals than I'd ever learned through family conversations. The application arrived the next morning via secure email, forwarded by Amanda Sterling with a cover note describing Michael and Jessica Walsh as ideal candidates for private financing. Their combined annual income was listed as $185,000, with minimal debt beyond their current mortgage and car payments. Their credit scores were both above 750, and they had substantial savings for a down payment and closing costs. What struck me most about the application wasn't the financial information, which was as solid as I'd expected, but the personal details that painted a picture of their aspirations and priorities. Under the section for intended use of the property, Jessica had written primary residence for growing family in prestigious neighborhood with excellent schools and professional networking opportunities. The phrase professional networking opportunities revealed everything about how they viewed homeownership. This wasn't just about finding a place to live, it was about positioning themselves within a social and professional community that aligned with their career ambitions. The house in Willowbrook Heights wasn't just a home, it was a strategic investment in their social capital. I spent 2 days reviewing their application with the same thorough analysis I applied to all potential borrowers. Despite my personal feelings about their treatment of me, I had to acknowledge that they represented an excellent credit risk. Their income was stable and growing. Their debt-to-income ratio was well within acceptable limits, and the property they wanted to purchase was in a desirable location with strong appreciation potential. On Friday morning, I called Amanda Sterling to discuss the application. As CM Walsh, I maintained a strictly professional relationship with all the real estate agents I worked with, communicating primarily through email and avoiding personal details that might compromise my privacy. Amanda knew me as a reliable lender who could close deals quickly, but she had no information about my personal life or family connections. "Miss Walsh," Amanda said when she took my call, "thank you for reviewing the application so quickly. Michael and Jessica Walsh are exactly the type of borrowers I hoped you'd be interested in working with. They're both professionals with stable incomes, and they're purchasing in one of the area's most desirable developments." "I've reviewed their financial information," I replied, using the crisp professional tone I'd developed for business calls. "They appear to meet our lending criteria. However, I do have some questions about their long-term plans and commitment to the area." "Of course. What would you like to know?" "The application mentions their intention to start a family. Have they considered how additional children might affect their financial situation and housing needs?" Amanda paused briefly, apparently surprised by the question. Most private lenders focused exclusively on current income and assets rather than future family planning considerations. "They've discussed that," she said carefully. Jessica mentioned that they're planning to wait at least 2 years before having children, which would give them time to build equity in the home and potentially refinance to a conventional mortgage with better terms. They view this property as their long-term family home rather than a starter house they'll outgrow quickly. And their current family support systems, do they have relatives in the area who might assist with childcare or other family responsibilities? This question was more personal than Amanda was expecting, and I could hear her hesitation as she formulated a response. I believe Michael's mother lives locally, she said slowly. I don't think they rely on family support for their current lifestyle, but I assume they would have that option available if needed. The irony of this exchange was almost overwhelming. Amanda was describing me as a potential resource for Michael and Jessica's future childcare needs while facilitating a loan application from the company I owned. She was unknowingly positioning me as both their financial creditor and their family support system, two roles that Jessica had made clear she preferred to keep separate. I see, I said. One final question. Do they have experience managing multiple financial obligations simultaneously? This loan would represent a significant monthly payment in addition to their current expenses. Yes, they've been very responsible with their current mortgage and other debt obligations, Amanda replied with growing confidence. Jessica actually has a background in financial planning from her consulting work, so she's very analytical about budgeting and expense management. I think they're well prepared for the additional financial responsibility. Jessica's background in financial planning was news to me. In all our family conversations, she'd never mentioned having expertise in financial management or budgeting. Apparently, she kept her professional skills as compartmentalized as I kept mine, sharing them only when they served her immediate purposes. Thank you for the additional information, I told Amanda. I'll make a decision on the application by Monday morning. That weekend, I made the most conflicted business decision of my career. From a purely financial perspective, lending to Michael and Jessica was an excellent opportunity. The terms I could offer would generate a strong return on investment while helping them achieve their homeownership goals. The risk was minimal, and the monthly payments would provide steady cash flow to my business. From a personal perspective, however, the loan represented a continuation of the one-sided relationship that had characterized our family dynamic for years. I would be providing significant financial assistance to fund their lifestyle upgrade while remaining excluded from their social life. They would benefit from my resources without acknowledging my contribution, just as they had unknowingly benefited from my real estate investments throughout their neighborhood without recognizing my role in their community's development. But there was a third consideration that ultimately influenced my decision. The loan would create a formal business relationship that might eventually provide an opportunity to reveal my true financial position in a context they couldn't ignore or dismiss. If circumstances ever required me to assert my rights as their mortgage holder, they would be forced to confront the reality of who Catherine Walsh actually was. On Monday morning, I called Amanda Sterling with my decision. Miss Sterling, this is CM Walsh. I've completed my review of the Walsh application and I'm prepared to offer financing terms. Wonderful, Amanda replied with obvious enthusiasm. What terms are you proposing? I'll lend $900,000 at 7.25% interest, amortized over 30 years with a balloon payment due in 7 years. The loan will be secured by the property, and I'll require standard title insurance and property insurance with CM Walsh Properties, named as the loss payee. Those terms sound very reasonable, Amanda said. The interest rate is actually lower than some of the other private lenders we've contacted. When could you close? I can close within 10 days of receiving a satisfactory property appraisal and title search, I replied. My attorney will prepare the loan documents once Mr. and Mrs. Walsh accept the terms. I'll contact them immediately. I'm confident they'll be thrilled with this offer. Amanda was right. Michael called me that evening, his voice filled with excitement and relief. Mom, we got approved for private financing, he said. Amanda found a lender who can close before our deadline, and the terms are better than we expected. We're going to get the house. That's wonderful news, I replied, feeling genuinely happy for him despite the complex circumstances. I'm glad the financing worked out. Jessica's already making plans for decorating and landscaping, Michael continued. She wants to host a housewarming party this summer once we're settled in. It's going to be a beautiful house, Mom. I think you'll really like it when you see it. The comment about seeing the house was the first suggestion in months that I might be included in their future plans, even peripherally. Whether Michael was being genuinely inclusive or simply caught up in the excitement of the moment, I appreciated the acknowledgement that I existed in their world. "I'd love to see it when you're ready for visitors," I said carefully, not wanting to assume too much from his casual comment. Over the next 2 weeks, as the closing process moved forward, I found myself in the surreal position of monitoring my son's home purchase from both sides of the transaction. As Catherine Walsh, I received updates from Michael about inspections, appraisals, and final preparations. As CM Walsh Properties, I worked with attorneys, title companies, and insurance agents to ensure all documentation was properly executed. The closing took place on a Thursday morning in early March at the offices of Chicago Title Company. I wasn't present, of course, having authorized my attorney to represent CM Walsh Properties at the signing, but I received copies of all the documents that afternoon, including the mortgage note signed by Michael and Jessica Walsh, pledging their new home as collateral for the $900,000 they'd borrowed from my company. That evening, Michael called to share the news that they were officially homeowners. "We got the keys this afternoon," he said with obvious pride. "Jessica's already over there measuring windows for curtains. The house is even more beautiful than we remembered from the showing." "Congratulations," I said sincerely. "Homeownership is a wonderful milestone. Are you planning to move in immediately?" "This weekend," Michael replied. "We hired movers for Saturday, and Jessica took the day off Friday to coordinate utility connections and deliveries. By Sunday night, we should be sleeping in our new house." As I listened to Michael's enthusiasm about their new home, I felt a complex mixture of pride and melancholy. I was genuinely happy that he was achieving his goals and building the life he wanted. At the same time, I was acutely aware that he was financing this milestone with money borrowed from the mother he'd been gradually excluding from his life for the past 4 years. The following month brought a predictable pattern of radio silence as Michael and Jessica focused on settling into their new home and neighborhood. Their weekends were consumed with unpacking, decorating, and exploring their new community. When Michael did call, usually on Sunday evenings, the conversations were brief and centered on practical updates about the move rather than personal connection. "The neighborhood is incredible," he told me during one such call in April. "Jessica's already joined the Homeowners Association and volunteered for the social committee. They organize monthly neighborhood gatherings, and there's a summer festival planned for July. Everyone we've met has been very welcoming." "It sounds like you're fitting in well," I observed, noting that his description focused on Jessica's social integration rather than his own. "Yeah, the neighbors are all professionals like us, lawyers, doctors, executives, consultants. There's a real sense of community among people who share similar values and goals. Jessica says it's exactly the environment she hoped for when we started looking at houses." The phrase "people who share similar values and goals" struck me as particularly revealing. Michael was describing their new neighborhood in terms that implicitly excluded people who didn't meet certain professional or economic criteria. His simple mother from Riverside Heights, with her modest lifestyle and lack of obvious career achievements, clearly wouldn't fit the demographic profile of Willowbrook Heights residents. In May, Jessica returned to our family narrative with a phone call that would set the stage for the final confrontation that was still months away. "Catherine," she began in her most professional tone, "I hope you don't mind me calling directly, but I wanted to update you on our housing situation and discuss some scheduling considerations for the summer." "Of course," I replied, though I suspected this conversation would follow the same pattern as her previous calls, polite updates followed by gentle exclusions. "The move went smoothly, and we're really loving the new house and neighborhood," Jessica continued. "Michael's commute is actually shorter from here, and I'm getting more client referrals from our neighbors than I expected. It's turned out to be an excellent decision both personally and professionally. I'm glad it's working out so well," I said, waiting for the inevitable qualification. "The thing is," Jessica said, confirming my expectations, "we're discovering that living in this type of community comes with certain social expectations and opportunities that we want to take full advantage of. The neighborhood has a very active social calendar, dinner parties, charity fundraisers, cultural events, and participating in these activities is important for building relationships with our neighbors." "That makes sense," I replied neutrally. "So we're going to be quite busy this summer with various commitments," Jessica continued. "I wanted to give you advance notice that our availability for family visits might be limited until we're more established in the community. We don't want to overcommit socially while we're still learning the neighborhood dynamics." This was perhaps the most honest explanation Jessica had ever given for excluding me from their lives. She was essentially saying that I didn't fit the social profile they were trying to establish in their new neighborhood, and my presence might compromise their efforts to integrate with their more sophisticated neighbors. I understand, I said, though the directness of her exclusion was more hurtful than her previous diplomatic evasions. I knew you would, Jessica replied with obvious relief. You've always been so understanding about our career obligations. Once we're more settled, maybe around the holidays, we can plan something more substantial. The holidays were 8 months away, effectively meaning that my son and daughter-in-law were announcing an 8-month hiatus from family contact while they established themselves in their new social environment. The irony that they were funding this social climbing with money borrowed from the woman they were excluding wasn't lost on me, though it would be many months before they understood that connection themselves. Well, I said carefully, I hope you both enjoy your summer in the new neighborhood. It sounds like a wonderful opportunity to build new friendships. Thank you for understanding, Jessica said. I really appreciate how supportive you've been during this transition. After the call ended, I sat in my home office looking at the mortgage documents that bore Michael and Jessica's signatures, thinking about the strange position I'd created for myself. I was literally their creditor, holding the legal right to foreclose on their home if they defaulted on their payments, while simultaneously being deemed unworthy of inclusion in the social life that home was meant to facilitate. The summer of 2022 passed with minimal contact from Michael and Jessica, exactly as Jessica had predicted. Occasional text messages and brief phone calls confirmed that they were enjoying their new lifestyle and making connections in their neighborhood. Social media posts showed them attending backyard barbecues, wine tastings, and charity events with their new neighbors, all carefully curated to project an image of sophisticated suburban success. In August, I received a business inquiry that would add another layer of complexity to an already intricate situation. Amanda Sterling called to discuss a potential investment opportunity in Willowbrook Heights itself. Miss Walsh, she began, I have a unique opportunity that might interest you. The developer of Willowbrook Heights is considering selling several undeveloped lots to private investors rather than building spec homes. Given your success with residential investments, I thought you might want to evaluate the potential. The lots in question were located on the same street as Michael and Jessica's new home, just 3 houses down from their property. The developer was asking $400,000 per lot, with the option to build custom homes for resale or rental. The location was ideal, and the profit potential was substantial given the demand for housing in that area. What's the timeline for a decision? I asked, already calculating the potential return on investment. They'd like to have commitments within 30 days, Amanda replied. The advantage of buying directly from the developer is that you'd have input on the home designs and could potentially build exactly what the market demands in that neighborhood. That evening, I drove through Willowbrook Heights to evaluate the lots Amanda had described. The neighborhood was indeed impressive: wide streets, mature landscaping, architectural variety within a cohesive aesthetic, and well-maintained properties that suggested a community of engaged homeowners. Michael and Jessica's house looked beautiful in its setting, with Jessica's decorating touches visible through the large front windows. As I sat in my car across from their home, I realized that purchasing the nearby lots would make me not just their mortgage holder, but also their neighbor, at least in terms of property ownership. The houses I might build on those lots would potentially increase their property values while generating substantial rental income or resale profits for my business. More significantly, owning property on their street would give me a legitimate reason to visit the neighborhood, potentially creating opportunities for casual encounters that might gradually reveal my connection to their community. The investment would be profitable while also positioning me to observe their new lifestyle firsthand. I made an offer on both lots the following week, proposing to pay cash for immediate closing in exchange for a modest discount from the asking price. The developer accepted quickly, apparently eager to convert unsold lots to immediate revenue. By the end of August, I owned 2 prime building lots, 3 doors down from my son's new home. The construction planning process occupied much of September and October. Working with an architect who specialized in luxury homes, I designed 2 complementary houses that would fit seamlessly into the neighborhood aesthetic, while incorporating features that would appeal to affluent buyers or renters. The larger house would be a 5-bedroom colonial, similar to Michael and Jessica's home, but with upgraded finishes and smart home technology. The smaller house would be a 4-bedroom contemporary design with an open floor plan and premium appliances. Construction began in November, with completion scheduled for the following summer. The timing would allow me to have the houses finished and ready for sale or rental, just as Michael and Jessica were approaching their first anniversary in Willowbrook Heights, potentially creating interesting opportunities for family interaction if they ever discovered my connection to their neighborhood development. As 2022 drew to a close, I found myself managing the most complex juggling act of my life. Professionally, my business was thriving with the Meridian portfolio generating strong returns and the Willowbrook Heights construction project proceeding on schedule. Personally, my relationship with Michael and Jessica had reached its most distant point yet, with holiday plans once again being postponed due to their social commitments in their new community. The Christmas cancellation, when it came, was delivered via text message rather than a phone call. Jessica informed me that they'd been invited to join several neighbors for a holiday progressive dinner party that would occupy their entire Christmas weekend. The event was apparently a neighborhood tradition for new residents, and they felt obligated to participate in order to continue building relationships with their community. "We'll plan something special for New Year's instead," Jessica texted, though I had learned not to rely on such promises. As I sat alone in my modest kitchen on Christmas Eve, reviewing financial reports from my various properties and investments, I reflected on the strange path my life had taken. I was wealthier than I'd ever imagined possible when I made that first duplex purchase 24 years earlier. My business success had exceeded every goal I'd set for myself, and I was financially secure enough to maintain my current lifestyle indefinitely without earning another dollar. Yet I was spending Christmas alone because my family had decided that I didn't fit their social aspirations, even as they unknowingly depended on my financial resources to fund those very aspirations. They were building their new life with money borrowed from the woman they considered too simple to include in their sophisticated social circle. The irony would have been amusing if it weren't so painful. But as I looked ahead to the new year, I sensed that the careful balance I'd maintained between my public and private identities was becoming increasingly unstable. The construction project in Willowbrook Heights would inevitably create opportunities for discovery, and Jessica's increasingly bold exclusions suggested that she felt secure in her assumption that I would always be a passive, understanding mother-in-law who would accept whatever role they assigned to me. What Jessica didn't understand was that passive acceptance had never been one of my defining characteristics. I'd built a multi-million-dollar business through decisive action and strategic thinking. I'd navigated complex financial markets and property transactions with confidence and skill. The quiet widow she saw as manageable and dismissible was the same person who had successfully competed against institutional investors and seasoned professionals for decades. The time was approaching when Catherine Walsh and C.M. Walsh Properties would need to become the same person in the eyes of my family. The question was no longer whether this revelation would occur, but when and under what circumstances. As 2023 began, I had a feeling that the circumstances would present themselves sooner than any of us expected. September 2023 brought an unexpected phone call that would accelerate everything I'd been carefully orchestrating for months. It was Amanda Sterling, and her voice carried an urgency I'd never heard before. "Miss Walsh, I have a situation that requires immediate attention," she began without her usual pleasantries. "One of my clients is facing potential foreclosure, and I need to understand your company's policies regarding loan modifications or payment deferrals." My heart stopped. There was only one active loan in Amanda's client portfolio that my company held. "Which property are we discussing?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "The Walsh residence in Willowbrook Heights. Michael Walsh lost his job 3 weeks ago, and while Jessica's consulting income is steady, it's not sufficient to cover their mortgage payments along with their other obligations. They're current through August, but they'll be unable to make the September payment." I set down my coffee cup with trembling hands, processing this information. Michael had lost his job and hadn't told me. They were facing financial crisis, and rather than reaching out to family for support, they'd gone directly to their real estate agent to explore loan modification options with their mortgage holder, not knowing that I was the person they needed to negotiate with. "What circumstances led to Mr. Walsh's employment termination?" I asked, maintaining my professional composure while my mind raced through the implications. "His company underwent a major restructuring. They eliminated his entire department and outsourced the functions to a firm in India. He received a modest severance package, but nothing that would cover their expenses for more than a few weeks." "And Mrs. Walsh's consulting income? She's been working to increase her client base, but most of her contracts are project-based rather than ongoing retainers. In a good month, she might earn enough to cover their basic living expenses, but not the mortgage payment and their other commitments." Amanda paused, then continued with obvious discomfort. There's another complication. They used most of their savings for the down payment and moving expenses when they purchased the house. They don't have significant reserves to draw from during this transition period. The irony was devastating. Michael and Jessica had stretched themselves financially to afford a lifestyle that would impress their new neighbors, and now that lifestyle was threatening to destroy them. They'd borrowed money from me to purchase a house they couldn't afford, in a neighborhood where they felt pressured to maintain appearances they could no longer sustain. "What specific accommodation are they requesting?" I asked. "Ideally, a 6-month payment deferral while Michael searches for new employment. They're confident he'll find something within that time frame, given his experience and qualifications. Alternatively, they'd consider a temporary reduction in payments if a full deferral isn't possible." I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of the decision I was facing. As CM Walsh Properties, I had every right to demand full payment according to the terms of the loan. I could begin foreclosure proceedings if they defaulted, potentially reclaiming the property and selling it to recover my investment. From a business perspective, the house had appreciated since their purchase, and I would likely profit from a foreclosure sale. But these weren't strangers who had defaulted on their obligations. This was my son, facing the kind of career setback that could happen to anyone in today's economy. The question was whether I should reveal my identity and offer family support, or maintain my business persona and handle this as I would any other troubled loan. "I'll need to review their complete financial situation before making any decisions," I told Amanda. "Please have them submit updated income documentation, expense statements, and a detailed plan for how they intend to resume regular payments." "Of course, I'll get that information to you within 48 hours. After Amanda hung up, I sat in my office staring at the loan file that contained Michael and Jessica's signatures on documents pledging their home as collateral for money they'd borrowed from me. The legal relationship was clear and binding. The personal relationship was about to become impossibly complicated. That evening, Michael called me for the first time in over a month. His voice was strained, carrying a defeat I'd never heard from him before. "Mom, I have some difficult news," he began. "I lost my job 3 weeks ago. The company eliminated my entire department, and I'm starting to look for new opportunities." "Oh, Michael," I said, genuinely heartbroken for him while simultaneously knowing far more about his situation than he realized. "I'm so sorry. What happened?" He explained the restructuring, the outsourcing, the sudden elimination of positions that had seemed secure just months earlier. As he talked, I could hear the bewilderment in his voice. He'd done everything right, worked hard, delivered results, maintained good relationships with colleagues and supervisors, yet none of that had protected him from corporate decisions made in boardrooms he'd never seen. "The severance package was reasonable, but not enough to carry us for very long," he continued. "Jessica's consulting work is helping, but we're having to make some tough decisions about expenses and priorities." "Are you okay financially?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "We'll be fine," he said quickly, the pride in his voice unmistakable. "I've got good prospects for new positions, and Jessica's building her client base. It's just a matter of managing cash flow during the transition." He was lying, of course, or at least minimizing the severity of their situation, but I understood his reluctance to admit financial vulnerability to his mother, especially after years of presenting himself as successfully independent. "If there's anything I can do to help," I offered carefully, "please don't hesitate to ask." "Thanks, Mom, but we've got it under control. I actually wanted to call because we might need to postpone some of our fall plans. We're being more conservative about spending until I get settled in a new position." The fall plans he was referring to were hypothetical at best. We hadn't made any concrete arrangements, and they'd been avoiding family contact for months. But I appreciated that he was trying to maintain some connection, even while managing his crisis privately. "I understand completely," I assured him. "Job transitions require focus. Take whatever time you need." Over the next 2 days, I watched Amanda's emails arrive with the financial documentation that painted a stark picture of Michael and Jessica's situation. Michael's final paycheck had been in early August. Jessica's consulting income averaged about $4,000 per month, but it was inconsistent and unpredictable. Their mortgage payment was $3,800 monthly, leaving virtually nothing for other expenses even in Jessica's best-earning months. Their credit card balances had increased significantly since Michael's job loss, suggesting they were using debt to cover basic living expenses. Most concerning, they'd already contacted other lenders about refinancing options, apparently hoping to find a conventional mortgage that would pay off their private loan and reduce their monthly payments. The refinancing attempts had been unsuccessful. Despite their good credit history, no bank wanted to take on borrowers with unstable income and high debt-to-income ratios. They were trapped in their current loan arrangement, unable to refinance and unable to make payments. As I reviewed their financial statements, I noticed something that added another layer of complexity to their situation. Jessica had listed several potential new clients in her income projections, including 2 companies whose names I recognized from my own business dealings. One was a property management firm that handled several of my commercial investments. The other was a marketing agency that had done promotional work for some of my residential developments. Jessica was apparently pursuing consulting contracts with businesses that were already connected to my investment portfolio. If she succeeded in landing those clients, she would unknowingly be earning money from companies that paid rent to my properties or used services funded by my investments. The web of connections between our financial lives was becoming increasingly intricate. On Friday morning, I made a decision that felt inevitable yet terrifying. I called Amanda Sterling to schedule a meeting with Michael and Jessica to discuss their loan modification request, but instead of meeting at my office or a neutral location, I requested that the meeting take place at their home in Willowbrook Heights. "That's unusual," Amanda said, clearly surprised by the request. "Most lenders prefer to conduct these discussions in their own offices." "This is a unique situation," I replied. "Given the personal nature of their financial difficulties, I think a more informal setting might be appropriate. Besides, I'd like to see the property in question firsthand." Amanda agreed to arrange the meeting for the following Tuesday evening. She would present it to Michael and Jessica as an opportunity to make their case directly to the decision-maker, emphasizing that my willingness to meet at their home suggested a positive disposition toward helping them work out their difficulties. I spent the weekend preparing for what would likely be the most difficult conversation of my life. I rehearsed different approaches, considered various ways to reveal my identity, and tried to anticipate their reactions. No matter how I imagined the scene unfolding, I couldn't envision it ending without permanent changes to our family relationships. On Sunday evening, Jessica called me, the first time she'd initiated contact in over 6 months. "Catherine," she began, her voice carrying a vulnerability I'd never heard before. "I wanted to reach out personally because Michael and I are going through a challenging time right now." "I'm glad you called," I said, though the irony of her timing wasn't lost on me. "Michael told you about losing his job, but I don't think he fully conveyed how stressful this situation has become for both of us. We're facing some financial pressures that are forcing us to reevaluate many aspects of our lives." I waited, giving her space to continue without prompting. "The thing is," Jessica said, "we've realized that we may have been too focused on building our careers and social connections at the expense of maintaining family relationships. This crisis has made us appreciate the importance of having supportive people in our lives, not just professional networks." The admission was more honest than anything Jessica had ever said to me, though it came at a moment when they needed support rather than when they had support to offer. "Family is always here when you need it," I replied carefully. "That's what family means." "I know, and I'm grateful for that." "Michael's been hesitant to ask for help because he's always prided himself on being independent, but I think we need to be more open to accepting support from people who care about us." I wondered if this was leading toward a request for financial assistance, and how I would respond if Jessica asked me directly for help while I was simultaneously preparing to meet with them as their mortgage holder. "What kind of support are you thinking about?" I asked. "Honestly, just knowing that you're there if we need you makes a difference. We may not be able to visit as frequently as we'd like while we're dealing with these challenges, but it's comforting to know that you understand what we're going through." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Jessica sharing more details about their situation than she'd revealed in years of previous conversations combined. She talked about the stress of uncertainty, the pressure of maintaining appearances in their neighborhood while facing financial difficulties, and the strain that money problems were putting on her marriage. "Michael's taking this very hard," she confided. "He feels like he's failed as a provider, even though the job loss wasn't his fault. He's questioning a lot of decisions we've made, including buying this house and taking on debt we're now struggling to manage." "Job loss is always difficult," I replied, "but it's not a reflection of personal failure. The economy affects everyone, regardless of their individual contributions or qualifications." I know that intellectually, but it's hard to convince Michael. He's always been so confident and successful that this setback has really shaken his self-image. As Jessica continued talking, I realized that she was sharing information that would be crucial for my decision about their loan modification request. She was unknowingly providing insights into their emotional state, their relationship dynamics, and their long-term commitment to working through their financial difficulties. More importantly, her willingness to reach out to me during their crisis suggested that their previous exclusions might have been driven more by social pressure and status anxiety than by genuine lack of affection. Perhaps there was still a foundation for rebuilding our family relationships if we could navigate the revelations that were about to occur. When we finally hung up, I felt a mixture of hope and dread about the approaching meeting. Jessica's call had reminded me that beneath their social climbing and status consciousness, Michael and Jessica were still the young couple who had once shared holiday dinners and family celebrations with genuine warmth. The question was whether that foundation could survive the discovery that their excluded mother-in-law was also their mortgage holder. Tuesday arrived with perfect autumn weather, crisp and clear with golden light filtering through the mature trees of Willowbrook Heights. As I drove through the neighborhood toward Michael and Jessica's house, I could see the construction progress on my own properties just 3 doors down. The larger house was nearly complete, with landscaping scheduled to begin the following week. The smaller house was still in the framing stage, but moving ahead on schedule. I parked across the street from their house and sat for a moment, gathering my courage for what was about to unfold. Through their front window, I could see Jessica arranging flowers in a vase, preparing their home for what she thought would be a routine business meeting with a sympathetic lender. Michael was visible in the kitchen, apparently preparing coffee or tea for their guests. They had no idea that the woman they'd excluded from family gatherings for years was about to walk through their front door as the person who held the power to foreclose on their home or offer them the financial relief they desperately needed. At exactly 6 o'clock, I walked up their front sidewalk and rang the doorbell, carrying a briefcase that contained not just their loan documents but also property deeds, construction contracts, and financial statements that would reveal the true scope of the life I'd built while they assumed I was simply Frank's simple widow. The door opened, and Jessica appeared with a welcoming smile that froze when she recognized me. "Catherine," she said, confusion evident in her voice. "What are you doing here?" Before I could answer, Amanda Sterling's car pulled into the driveway, and I heard Michael calling from inside the house, asking who was at the door. "I think," I said quietly, looking directly into Jessica's eyes, "it's time we had a conversation about mortgages, family, and the assumptions people make about quiet widows who drive old Honda Accords." The expression that crossed Jessica's face in that moment, confusion giving way to dawning comprehension and then to something approaching fear, was one I would remember for the rest of my life. She was beginning to understand that the evening wasn't going to unfold as she'd expected, though she had no idea yet just how dramatically her world was about to change. The silence in the foyer stretched for what felt like an eternity as Jessica stared at me, her mind clearly racing to process why I was standing on her doorstep at the exact moment she was expecting a meeting with their mortgage holder. Behind her, I could hear Michael's footsteps approaching, and Amanda Sterling was walking up the sidewalk with her professional portfolio in hand. "Mom," Michael appeared beside Jessica, his confusion matching hers. "What are you doing here? We're expecting Miss Walsh," Amanda called out cheerfully as she reached the front steps. "Perfect timing. Michael, Jessica, I'd like you to meet C.M. Walsh, the owner of C.M. Walsh Properties." The color drained from both their faces as Amanda's words hit them like a physical blow. Jessica's hand gripped the doorframe for support, while Michael's mouth opened and closed without producing any sound. The briefcase in my hand suddenly felt like evidence of a crime, and the weight of 8 years of deception settled heavily on my shoulders. "I think," I said quietly, looking between my son and daughter-in-law, "we should move this conversation inside." Jessica stepped back mechanically, her movements robotic as she processed the impossible coincidence that her excluded mother-in-law was also the private lender who held their mortgage. Michael remained frozen in the doorway until Amanda gently suggested that perhaps we should all sit down to discuss the loan modification options. "Loan modification," Michael repeated numbly, as if the words belonged to a foreign language he was struggling to translate. We moved into their elegantly appointed living room, the same space I'd helped finance but had never been invited to see during family visits. Jessica automatically went through the motions of offering coffee and refreshments, her social conditioning taking over while her mind struggled with the enormity of what was being revealed. Amanda, oblivious to the family dynamics at play, spread loan documents across their coffee table with professional efficiency. As I mentioned on the phone, Ms. Walsh has agreed to meet here to discuss your financial situation and explore options for keeping you current on your mortgage payments. I watched Michael sink into his leather armchair, staring at the documents that bore his signature and my company's letterhead. The irony wasn't lost on any of us that he was sitting in furniture purchased with money he'd borrowed from the mother he'd been excluding from his life for years. "I don't understand," Jessica finally managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. "CM Walsh Properties, that's you. You've been our mortgage holder this entire time." "Yes," I replied simply, seeing no point in elaborate explanations when the truth was sitting in black and white on their coffee table. "But how? When? We never—" Michael trailed off, apparently unable to formulate a complete question. Amanda glanced between us, sensing undercurrents she didn't understand but maintaining her professional composure. "Ms. Walsh, would you like to review the current situation before we discuss modification options?" "I'm quite familiar with the situation," I said, opening my briefcase and retrieving a thick folder. Michael and Jessica Walsh purchased 147 Maple Ridge Drive on March 15, 2022, with a $900,000 loan at 7.25% interest, amortized over 30 years with a balloon payment due in 2029. As I recited the terms of their loan, I watched the mathematical reality sink in. They were hearing their financial obligations described by the woman they'd dismissed as a simple retiree who couldn't afford to maintain her modest house without their theoretical support. "Current balance is $867,412, I continued, consulting the documents. "Last payment received August 1, 2023, monthly payment of $3,847 is now 28 days past due." Jessica made a small sound, something between a gasp and a sob. The clinical recitation of their debt delivered in my familiar voice was apparently more devastating than any foreclosure notice could have been. "How long have you been doing this?" Michael asked, finding his voice at last. "How long have you been investing in real estate?" 25 years, I replied. "I started with a duplex I purchased using my grandmother's inheritance in 19— I was in high school." "You were doing this while I was in high school, and you never said anything?" "Your father knew about the rental properties," I said carefully, "but he assumed it was a small hobby that generated minimal income." I never corrected his assumptions. "A hobby," Jessica said, her voice hollow. "This is your hobby? The portfolio is valued at approximately $42 million. I wouldn't characterize it as a hobby." The numbers hit them like successive waves. Amanda Sterling's eyebrows had risen considerably during my recitation, apparently surprised to learn the true scope of her client's business operations. $42 million, Michael said slowly. "You're worth $42 million? The business is worth that amount," I corrected. "My personal net worth is somewhat higher when you include other investments and liquid assets." Jessica suddenly stood up, pacing to the window that overlooked their front yard. "All these years," she said, her back to us. "All these years you let us treat you like you needed our help, like you were struggling to get by on Dad's pension." "I never said I was struggling," I replied. "You assumed it. But you let us assume it." Michael burst out, his shock giving way to anger. "You let us exclude you from dinners because Jessica thought you wouldn't fit in with her colleagues, while you were secretly rich enough to buy and sell everyone in this neighborhood." "I wasn't secretly rich," I said, my own voice hardening slightly. "I was openly successful in my professional life while being dismissed and excluded from my family life. There's a significant difference." Amanda cleared her throat diplomatically. "Perhaps we should focus on the loan modification request. I'm sure you can sort out family matters privately." "No," Jessica said, turning back to face us. "This is exactly about family matters. Catherine, do you realize what you've done? You've been sitting there for years, watching us struggle with career decisions and financial planning, knowing you had resources that could have helped, but instead you've been secretly judging us while we borrowed money from you without knowing it." "I haven't been judging anyone," I replied. "I've been managing my business and trying to maintain relationships with family members who made it clear that my presence was an inconvenience to their social aspirations." "That's not fair," Michael protested. "We never said your presence was an inconvenience." "You didn't need to say it," I replied. Jessica's email to the restaurant explained that I was a bit simple and should be seated somewhere not too prominent, perhaps near the kitchen where I'd be more comfortable. "Your actions have spoken quite clearly about how you view my place in your lives." The reference to Jessica's email, which they had no idea I'd seen, created another moment of stunned silence. Jessica's face flushed crimson as she realized, I somehow knew about her attempt to minimize my presence at their anniversary dinner. "How do you know about that email?" she whispered. "Because the restaurant you chose for your celebration was Cioria," I replied. "And I happen to own significant commercial real estate in this area, including several properties leased to upscale restaurants." It wasn't exactly true. I had no connection to Cioria, but the implication that I might have business relationships they knew nothing about was enough to rattle them further. Amanda gathered her papers with obvious discomfort. "I think perhaps I should let you discuss these family matters privately and reschedule our business meeting for another time." "No," I said firmly. "We're here to discuss the loan modification request, and that's exactly what we're going to do. Michael and Jessica need to understand their options, regardless of any family complications." I opened another folder from my briefcase, revealing detailed financial projections and payment modification scenarios I'd prepared after reviewing their situation. "Based on your current income and expenses," I began, returning to my professional tone, "I can offer several options. First, a 6-month payment deferral with interest continuing to accrue, extending your loan term accordingly. Second, a temporary reduction to interest-only payments for 12 months, allowing you to maintain your payment history while Michael secures new employment. Third, a loan restructuring that would reduce your monthly payments permanently in exchange for a higher interest rate." As I outlined each option, I watched their faces carefully. The relief at having viable solutions was evident, but it was overshadowed by the ongoing shock of learning that their financial salvation was coming from the woman they'd systematically excluded from their lives. "What would you recommend?" Michael asked quietly. "From a business perspective," I replied, "the temporary payment reduction makes the most sense. It preserves your credit rating while giving you time to stabilize your income. From a family perspective," I paused, meeting his eyes directly. "I think you need to decide what kind of relationship you want to have with me going forward." "What do you mean?" Jessica asked, though I suspected she already knew. "I mean that continuing to borrow money from someone you exclude from family gatherings creates an uncomfortable dynamic for everyone involved. Either I'm family, deserving of inclusion and respect, or I'm a business relationship, subject to standard commercial terms and conditions." The ultimatum hung in the air between us. I hadn't planned to be so direct, but the emotional weight of years of exclusion combined with the immediate crisis had crystallized my position with startling clarity. "You can't do this," Jessica said, her voice rising. "You can't use our financial crisis to force us into family obligations. That's manipulation." "I'm not forcing anything," I replied calmly. "I'm offering the same loan modification terms I would offer to any borrower in your situation. But I'm also pointing out that borrowing money from family members you don't treat as family creates complications that purely business relationships don't have." Michael stood up abruptly, running his hands through his hair. "I need some air," he announced, walking toward the back door that led to their patio. Amanda used his departure as an opportunity to excuse herself entirely. "I'll let you work through these decisions privately," she said, gathering her remaining papers. "Ms. Walsh, should I plan to follow up with formal modification documents once they've made their choice?" "Yes," I replied. "I'll have my attorney prepare the paperwork once we've agreed on terms." After Amanda left, Jessica and I sat in uncomfortable silence, listening to Michael pacing on the patio outside. Through the window I could see him on his phone, presumably calling someone for advice or support. "I never wanted it to be like this," Jessica said finally, her professional composure cracking to reveal genuine distress. "I never intended to hurt you or exclude you deliberately." "But you did exclude me," I replied, repeatedly and systematically, always with polite explanations that made it sound like the exclusion was for my own good. "Because I thought," she started, then stopped, apparently reconsidering her words. "Because you thought I was simple and unsophisticated," I finished for her. "Because you thought I wouldn't fit in with your ambitious friends and colleagues. Because you saw me as a reminder of a less glamorous past that didn't align with your future aspirations." Jessica's silence confirmed my assessment. She stared at her hands, tears threatening to spill from her eyes. "I work in marketing," she said quietly. "I'm supposed to be good at reading people, understanding motivations, seeing through surface presentations to underlying realities, but I completely misjudged you. I saw what I expected to see instead of paying attention to who you actually were." "And what did you expect to see?" I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. "Frank's widow," she replied immediately. "Someone who would need guidance and support as she adjusted to life alone. Someone grateful for inclusion in our modern, successful lives. someone who would appreciate being invited into our world occasionally, rather than someone who had built a world of her own that dwarfed ours. The honesty in her response surprised me. It was the most direct acknowledgement she'd ever made of the condescending assumptions that had shaped her treatment of me. Michael returned from the patio, his expression grim but determined. "I talked to my lawyer," he announced. "He says we need to be very careful about mixing family relationships with business obligations. He thinks we should consider refinancing with a different lender to eliminate the conflict of interest." "That's certainly an option," I replied, though we all knew that refinancing wasn't viable given their current financial situation, though you might find it challenging to secure conventional financing while Michael is unemployed. "So we're trapped," Michael said bitterly. "We either accept your family ultimatum or face foreclosure because no other lender will touch us." "You're not trapped," I corrected. "You have choices. You can accept a loan modification that will help you through this difficult period, regardless of our family relationship, or you can work toward refinancing once your income stabilizes. What you can't do is continue to pretend that borrowing money from family members doesn't create responsibilities and expectations that go beyond standard commercial lending." The conversation continued for another hour, with emotions ranging from anger to confusion to grudging acceptance of the new reality we all faced. By the time I left their house that evening, we had agreed on a 12-month interest-only payment plan that would reduce their monthly obligation to $2,400 while Michael searched for employment. More importantly, we had agreed to begin the difficult process of rebuilding our family relationship on more honest foundations. Jessica admitted that her exclusions had been driven by status anxiety rather than practical considerations. Michael acknowledged that he had allowed those exclusions to continue because challenging them would have required confronting uncomfortable truths about his own values and priorities. As I drove home through the darkening neighborhood, I felt a strange mixture of relief and apprehension. The revelation was finally over, but the real work of reconstruction was just beginning. Whether we could build something genuine and lasting from the rubble of assumptions and hurt feelings remained to be seen. But for the first time in years, I was optimistic that Catherine Walsh and C.M. Walsh Properties could finally be the same person in the eyes of my family. The aftermath of that Tuesday evening revelation unfolded over the following weeks like aftershocks from an earthquake. On Wednesday morning, I received a formal email from Michael requesting the loan modification documents, written in carefully neutral language that avoided any reference to our family relationship. By Thursday, Jessica had sent a separate message asking if we could meet privately to discuss moving forward constructively. What surprised me most was the call I received Friday afternoon from Amanda Sterling. "Walsh," she began, her professional tone carrying a hint of embarrassment, "I need to apologize for not recognizing the family connection during Tuesday's meeting. I pride myself on thoroughness, but I completely missed the relationship between you and my clients." "There was no reason you would have connected Catherine Walsh with C.M. Walsh Properties," I replied. "I've maintained that separation intentionally for many years." "Still, I should have been more observant. In any case, I wanted to discuss something confidential that might interest you professionally. Several other properties in Willowbrook Heights are likely to come on the market soon, and given your success with real estate investments in that area, I thought you might want first consideration." The other properties she was referring to would prove to be more significant than either of us realized at the time. Two families in Michael's neighborhood were facing similar employment disruptions, and a third was relocating for business reasons. The economic pressures that had affected my son were rippling through their entire social circle. "What's the timeline for these potential listings?" I asked. "The next 60 to 90 days, most likely. I know you prefer to work quickly when opportunities align with your investment strategy." As we discussed the details, I realized that Amanda had unknowingly provided me with information that would reshape my approach to both my business expansion and my family relationships. If several houses in Willowbrook Heights were available, I could potentially acquire rental properties that would make me not just Michael's mortgage holder but also his neighbor in multiple senses. That weekend, I made a decision that felt both strategic and symbolic. Instead of meeting Jessica at a neutral location, I invited her to visit my actual home for the first time since Frank's funeral 6 years earlier. I wanted her to see the life I'd built, not as a defensive gesture, but as an honest foundation for whatever relationship we might construct going forward. She arrived Saturday afternoon, driving her BMW with obvious reluctance through my modest neighborhood. I watched from my front window as she parked in my driveway, sitting in her car for several minutes as if gathering courage before walking to my front door. "Catherine," she said when I answered her knock, Thank you for agreeing to meet with me privately. I led her into my living room, which I decorated with framed photographs documenting my real estate investments over the years. Property acquisitions, construction projects, ribbon cuttings for commercial developments, evidence of a professional life she'd never suspected existed. Jessica moved through the room slowly, studying each photograph with the careful attention of someone reassessing fundamental assumptions. When she reached the photos from my most recent Chicago acquisitions, she stopped completely. "This building," she said, pointing to an image of a downtown office complex, "I interviewed for a client meeting here last month. The company mentioned their landlord was very professional and responsive to tenant needs." "Building management is crucial for maintaining occupancy rates," I replied matter-of-factly. "You were my potential client's landlord," Jessica said, shaking her head. "I was in your building, negotiating with companies that pay rent to you, and I had no idea." She continued around the room, discovering connections between my investments and her professional world that neither of us had recognized. The property management firm that had become one of her best clients operated from a strip mall I owned. The marketing agency that referred projects to her leased office space in a complex I'd developed 3 years earlier. "How much of my consulting success has been indirectly connected to your investments?" she asked, settling into Frank's old armchair. "More than you realized," I admitted, "but your professional skills earned those contracts. The connections were coincidental." "Were they?" Jessica challenged. "Or were you quietly orchestrating opportunities for me while I was excluding you from family gatherings?" The question caught me off guard. I hadn't consciously directed business toward Jessica's consulting firm, but I had invested in properties that housed companies likely to need marketing services. Whether my investment choices had subconsciously benefited her career was difficult to determine. "I invest in properties that show strong growth potential," I said carefully. "If that growth has created opportunities for your business, it's because you positioned yourself well within an expanding market." Jessica sat back, processing this information. "Michael thinks you've been manipulating us," she said quietly. "Creating situations where we'd become dependent on you financially without realizing it." "And what do you think?" I asked. "I think," Jessica said slowly, "that you've been protecting us from consequences we didn't know we were risking, while we've been treating you like an obligation rather than an asset." Her choice of words, asset rather than family member, revealed how naturally she viewed relationships through professional frameworks, but there was genuine remorse in her voice that suggested she was beginning to understand the emotional cost of her exclusions. "I need to ask you something directly," Jessica continued. "When we applied for the mortgage through Amanda, did you approve our loan because we were good credit risks, or because we're family?" "Both," I replied honestly. "You represented a sound investment, but I also wanted to help Michael achieve his homeownership goals. And when we started missing payments, were you planning to foreclose if we couldn't work something out?" This question required more careful consideration. From a business perspective, foreclosure would have been profitable given the property's appreciation. From a family perspective, it would have been devastating. "I was planning to offer reasonable modification terms regardless of our family relationship," I said. "But I was also planning to use the situation to address the exclusions that had characterized our interactions for years." Jessica nodded slowly. "So you were manipulating the situation to force a family confrontation." "I was creating an opportunity for honest conversation," I corrected. "Manipulation suggests deception." "I've been entirely transparent about the loan terms and my identity as the lender." "Transparent after we discovered your identity accidentally," Jessica pointed out. "If Amanda hadn't introduced you as CM Walsh, would you ever have told us?" The question highlighted the fundamental tension that would shape any future relationship between us. I had maintained my dual identity for valid reasons, but the deception had created circumstances that felt manipulative regardless of my intentions. "I was looking for the right opportunity to integrate my business and personal identities," I said. "Your financial crisis accelerated that timeline, but it didn't create my desire for change." We talked for another 2 hours, working through layers of hurt feelings, misunderstandings, and mutual resentments that had accumulated over years of carefully polite but fundamentally dishonest interactions. Jessica acknowledged that her exclusions had been driven by professional insecurity and social anxiety rather than practical considerations. I admitted that maintaining my financial privacy had sometimes prevented me from offering help that might have benefited both Michael and Jessica. "What happens now?" Jessica asked as our conversation wound down. How do we rebuild a relationship that's been compromised by so many assumptions and deceptions? We start with honesty, I replied. No more assumptions about who each other is or what each other needs. No more exclusions based on social anxiety or professional image management. No more secrets about important aspects of our lives. That sounds reasonable in theory, Jessica said. But practically, how do we navigate having a family relationship with someone who also holds our mortgage? The power dynamic makes everything complicated. It was a valid concern. The financial relationship between us would always create potential for conflicts that purely personal relationships didn't face. If Michael and Jessica defaulted on future payments, I would need to protect my business interests regardless of family considerations. We establish clear boundaries, I suggested. Family decisions get made by family members. Business decisions get made by business partners. When those roles conflict, we address the conflicts directly rather than pretending they don't exist. Jessica seemed to consider this framework. And what about Michael? He's been even more upset than I have about the revelation. He feels like you deceived him about fundamental aspects of your identity. Michael's anger is understandable, I acknowledged. He's processing not just the financial relationship, but also the realization that he accepted my exclusion from family activities while I was quietly supporting his lifestyle in ways he never recognized. He's also questioning whether you helped us get the mortgage because you wanted to maintain some level of control over our lives, Jessica added. The timing feels too convenient to be coincidental. This was the heart of Michael's concern, and it deserved a direct response. The loan was a sound business decision that also helped family members achieve their goals, I said. If Michael interprets that as control rather than support, we'll need to work through his feelings about accepting help from family members. Is that what this is about? Jessica asked. Michael's pride about accepting help? Partly, I replied, but it's also about Michael's assumptions regarding my capabilities and his father's influence on how he views women's professional achievements. The reference to Frank's attitudes touched on territory we hadn't discussed directly. Jessica knew that Frank had held traditional views about gender roles, but she might not have realized how those views had shaped Michael's expectations about my post-widowhood life. Frank never saw me as a business partner, I continued. He saw me as a homemaker who dabbled in real estate as a hobby. Michael inherited those assumptions and never questioned them, even after Frank's death. Until Tuesday night, Jessica observed. Until Tuesday night, I agreed. As Jessica prepared to leave, she paused at my front door with a question that surprised me. Catherine, would you be willing to have dinner with us next weekend? Not as our mortgage holder, not as a business contact, but as Michael's mother and my mother-in-law. I think we need to practice having normal family interactions before we can figure out how to handle the complicated aspects of our relationship. The invitation was the first genuine family inclusion I'd received in years, and it came at a moment when our relationship was more complicated than it had ever been. But it also represented exactly the kind of honest engagement I'd been hoping to achieve. I'd like that very much, I replied. Good. And Catherine, I want you to feel comfortable being yourself completely. No more careful editing of your accomplishments or downplaying your success to make us feel better about our assumptions. The following week brought developments that would test our new commitment to honesty sooner than any of us expected. On Monday morning, I received a call from Marcus Rodriguez with news about a major development opportunity that would affect Willowbrook Heights directly. Catherine, he said, his voice carrying the excitement that always accompanied his biggest deals, I've got something that's going to interest you significantly. The city has approved a major infrastructure improvement project for the Willowbrook Heights area. New roads, upgraded utilities, enhanced public transportation access. What's the timeline? I asked, immediately calculating the impact on property values throughout Michael's neighborhood. Construction begins next spring, completion scheduled for late 2025. Property values in that area are expected to increase by 15 to 20% once the improvements are finished. The news was professionally exciting but personally complicated. My existing investments in Willowbrook Heights, including the 2 houses under construction, would appreciate significantly. More importantly, Michael and Jessica's home would likely gain substantial equity, improving their financial position considerably, but the infrastructure improvements would also make the neighborhood more attractive to developers, potentially leading to increased density and commercial development that might change its character entirely. As someone with significant property holdings in the area, I would need to decide whether to expand my investments or divest before the changes altered the community's appeal. Are you interested in additional acquisitions before the public announcement drives up prices? Definitely, I replied, but I'll need to move carefully. Some of my investments in that area involve family considerations that complicate business decisions. Family considerations? Marcus asked, surprised. He'd never known me to let personal relationships influence investment strategies. It's a long story, I said, but yes, I need to balance profit potential with personal relationships in ways I haven't had to consider before. That evening, Michael called with news of his own. He'd received 2 job offers, both with salaries that would allow them to resume full mortgage payments and begin rebuilding their savings. The first offer is with a consulting firm here in Chicago, he explained. Good salary, excellent benefits, opportunity for advancement. The second offer is with a technology company in Austin. Higher salary, stock options, but it would require relocating. What are you leaning toward? I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. Jessica wants to stay in Chicago, Michael replied. She's built good client relationships here, and moving would mean starting over professionally, but the Austin opportunity is significantly better financially. And the mortgage factor? I asked, addressing the practical reality that moving would require either selling their house or converting it to a rental property. That's part of what we need to discuss, Michael said. If we move to Austin, we'd want to sell the house rather than become long-distance landlords, but we'd need to coordinate with you as the mortgage holder to ensure the sale proceeds covered our loan balance. The conversation represented exactly the kind of honest family discussion we'd committed to having. Michael was acknowledging our financial relationship while treating me as a family member whose input mattered for their decision-making. Have you gotten a current market appraisal? I asked. Amanda's preparing a comparative market analysis, Michael replied. Initial estimates suggest we'd break even or show a small profit, depending on closing costs and market conditions. What Michael didn't know was that the infrastructure improvements would likely increase their property value by $50,000 to $70,000 over the next 18 months. If they waited to sell until after the public announcement, they could potentially pay off their entire loan and have substantial cash remaining for their relocation. But sharing that information would mean revealing my advanced knowledge of developments that weren't yet public, potentially creating another layer of ethical complexity in our business relationship. As I prepared for our first family dinner in years, I found myself navigating questions I'd never anticipated when I started building my real estate empire. How much responsibility did I have to share business intelligence that could benefit my family financially? How could I maintain professional relationships while honoring family commitments? And most challenging of all, how could I help Michael and Jessica make decisions that were best for them while protecting my own business interests? The answers would shape not just our family relationships, but also my approach to the intersection of personal and professional life that I'd kept separate for so many years. 6 months later, I stood in the kitchen of my newly completed house at 1253 Maple Ridge Drive, 3 doors down from Michael and Jessica's home, preparing for what had become our monthly family dinner tradition. The irony wasn't lost on me that after years of being excluded from their dinner table, I was now hosting family gatherings in a house I'd built in their own neighborhood. The decision to move to Willowbrook Heights hadn't been purely sentimental. When the infrastructure development was publicly announced in November, property values had jumped exactly as Marcus had predicted. My 2 new construction homes had immediately appreciated by $60,000 each, making the move financially advantageous as well as personally symbolic. More importantly, living in the same neighborhood had forced all of us to navigate our new family dynamic in real time. There was no retreating to separate social circles when uncomfortable questions arose, no postponing difficult conversations when business and family interests conflicted. Michael had ultimately chosen the Chicago job offer, a decision influenced partly by Jessica's professional ties but mostly by his desire to rebuild our family relationship without the complication of geographic distance. The decision had required honest conversations about his career priorities that surprised all of us with their depth and maturity. I spent so many years trying to impress Dad by following his definition of success. He'd told me during one of our weekly coffee meetings that had become routine since the revelation. Taking the Austin job would have felt like chasing another external validation rather than building something authentic here. The weekly coffee meetings had evolved from awkward attempts at reconciliation into genuine opportunities for connection. We discussed everything from market trends and investment strategies to family history and personal goals. Michael had expressed interest in learning more about real estate investing, not as a career change but as a way to understand the business that had shaped so much of my adult life. Jessica's transformation had been even more dramatic. The infrastructure announcement had created opportunities for her consulting business that exceeded her most optimistic projections. With my encouragement, she'd positioned herself as a specialist in marketing for development projects, leveraging her knowledge of Willowbrook Heights and similar communities to attract clients throughout the Chicago suburbs. "I want to earn success that's completely independent of any connection to your business," she'd insisted when I offered to facilitate introductions to developers in my network. "That's admirable," I'd replied, "but turning down legitimate opportunities because of family connections would be as artificial as accepting opportunities you hadn't earned." We'd eventually found a middle ground where I provided general market intelligence and strategic advice while Jessica built her client relationships through her own networking and reputation. Her business had grown significantly, but on foundations she could be confident were her own. The kitchen where I was now preparing dinner reflected the integration of my personal and professional identities that had taken months to achieve comfortably. Photographs from property developments hung alongside family pictures, business awards shared wall space with Michael's childhood artwork, and my grandmother's recipes were filed next to investment prospectuses. "Mom, something smells incredible," Michael said, arriving early as had become his habit for our family dinners. "What's the menu tonight?" "Your grandmother's pot roast with my own modifications," I replied, checking the oven. "And Jessica's favorite dessert from that bakery downtown." Michael moved around my kitchen with the familiarity of someone who'd become genuinely comfortable in my space. He'd started bringing his own coffee beans for our after-dinner conversations, and he'd learned to operate my espresso machine better than I could. "I have news," he announced, leaning against the counter. "Amanda Sterling called today. She's got a buyer interested in our house." This was a development I'd been expecting but dreading. Michael and Jessica's home had appreciated substantially since the infrastructure announcement, and they'd been discussing whether to sell and purchase something larger or stay and renovate their current space. "Are you planning to accept the offer?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "We want to," Michael replied. "The offer is $200,000 above what we paid originally. After paying off the mortgage and covering closing costs, we'd have enough cash for a substantial down payment on a larger house." The numbers meant they could pay off their loan to CM Walsh Properties entirely, eliminating the business relationship that had complicated our family dynamic since the revelation. From a purely personal perspective, I was relieved that we could separate our financial and family connections. From a business perspective, I was losing a reliable monthly income stream. "Have you identified a new house?" I asked. "Actually," Michael said with a grin, "we're hoping to stay in the neighborhood. There's a house going on the market next week that would be perfect for us. Larger lot, updated kitchen, room for the family we're hoping to start soon." The news about their family planning was the most significant development yet. Jessica had mentioned casually that they were discussing children, but this was the first direct confirmation that they were actively preparing for parenthood. "Congratulations," I said, genuinely delighted. "Where is this new house located?" 1267 Maple Ridge Drive, Michael replied. "Right next door to you." I nearly dropped the serving spoon I was holding. They were planning to buy the house immediately adjacent to mine, which would make us literal next-door neighbors rather than just residents of the same neighborhood. "The sellers are moving to Florida for retirement," Michael continued, apparently oblivious to my shock. "Amanda thinks we can get it for asking price if we move quickly, and the timing works perfectly with selling our current house. And Jessica is comfortable living next door to me," I asked, needing to confirm that this wasn't Michael's unilateral decision. "It was her idea, actually," Michael replied. "She says that after everything we've been through this year, she can't imagine raising children anywhere except close to their grandmother." The emotional impact of hearing myself referred to as a future grandmother hit me unexpectedly. For years I'd assumed that my exclusion from their lives meant I'd also be excluded from any grandchildren's lives. The possibility that I might be actively involved in raising the next generation felt like a gift I'd stopped allowing myself to hope for. Jessica arrived 20 minutes later, carrying flowers from her garden and a bottle of wine that she'd learned to choose based on my preferences rather than price point. "Catherine," she said, kissing my cheek in a gesture that had become natural rather than obligatory, "thank you for hosting again. I know these dinners are more work for you than eating out would be." "I enjoy cooking for my family," I replied, a phrase that would have sounded impossible 6 months earlier. As we settled around my dining room table, I looked at the two people who had caused me so much pain and confusion over the years, marveling at how dramatically our relationships had evolved. Jessica was describing a new client project with genuine enthusiasm, asking my opinion about market strategies and competitive positioning. Michael was sharing details about his work responsibilities, including challenges that he'd never mentioned during our previous superficial conversations. "I've been thinking about something," Jessica said, as we cleared the dinner plates. "With the baby planning and the new house, we're going to need reliable childcare support. I know it's presumptuous to assume, but would you be interested in being actively involved as a grandmother?" The question addressed the elephant in the room that none of us had wanted to discuss directly. Jessica's successful consulting business required travel and irregular hours that would be difficult to manage with traditional daycare arrangements. Michael's new position offered flexibility, but also demanded project deadlines that could require extended work periods. "I would be honored to help with childcare," I replied carefully, "but I want to make sure we're all comfortable with the boundaries between family support and business independence." "What do you mean?" Michael asked. "I mean that accepting significant help with childcare from someone who's also your former mortgage holder and current neighbor creates obligations and expectations that we should discuss openly," I explained. Jessica nodded thoughtfully. "You're right. We need to be clear about what kinds of help we're offering each other and what kinds of obligations those create." We spent the next hour developing what Jessica called our family charter, explicit agreements about financial boundaries, childcare responsibilities, and decision-making processes that would prevent misunderstandings as our lives became more intertwined. The most important agreement was that business relationships between us would be conducted through formal channels with proper documentation, while family relationships would be governed by mutual respect and honest communication. If conflicts arose between business and family interests, we would address them directly rather than allowing resentment to build through indirect communication. "There's something else we need to discuss," I said as we moved to the living room for coffee and dessert. "The infrastructure development is going to change this neighborhood significantly over the next few years. Property values will continue rising, but the character of the community might change in ways that affect your decision to raise children here." "What kinds of changes?" Jessica asked. I explained the development timeline, the planned commercial additions, and the increased traffic that would accompany improved transportation access. While the changes would benefit property values, they might also eliminate some of the quiet suburban appeal that had attracted young families to Willowbrook Heights. "Are you planning to sell your properties before the development is completed?" Michael asked. "I'm considering my options," I replied, "but my decision will depend partly on whether you and Jessica decide to stay in the neighborhood long term." "Why would our decision affect your investment strategy?" Jessica asked. "Because," I said, choosing my words carefully, "being near family has become more important to me than maximizing short-term profits. If you're planning to raise children here, I'd rather maintain my investments and be part of that community." The admission represented a fundamental shift in how I approached business decisions. For 25 years, I'd made investment choices based purely on financial projections and market analysis. Now I was acknowledging that personal relationships could legitimately influence professional strategies. "That means a lot to us," Michael said quietly. "Knowing that you're planning to stay makes our decision to buy the house next door feel like we're building something permanent rather than just making another real estate transaction." As the evening wound down, Jessica helped me clean up while Michael reviewed some investment documents I'd offered to share with him. Watching them move comfortably through my home, discussing future plans that included me as an integral part rather than an occasional visitor, I felt a satisfaction that no business success had ever provided. "Catherine," Jessica said as she dried the last wine glass, "can I ask you something personal?" "Of course. Do you ever regret keeping your business success private for so many years? Do you think our relationship might have developed differently if we'd known who you really were from the beginning?" The question required careful consideration. Privacy had protected me from the kind of relationship complications we were now navigating, but it had also prevented authentic connections that might have enriched all our lives. "I regret the exclusions," I said finally, "but I don't regret building something that was entirely my own before sharing it with my family. The business gave me confidence and independence that I might not have developed if I'd been seeking approval or validation from family members." "And now?" Jessica asked. "Now I think we're building something better than what any of us had before. More complicated, but more honest." 3 weeks later, the house sales and purchases were completed with efficient precision that Amanda Sterling attributed to having experienced investors involved in both transactions. Michael and Jessica sold their original house for exactly the price they'd hoped for, paid off their loan to CM Walsh Properties, and purchased the house next door with a conventional mortgage that eliminated any business relationship between us. I helped them move, not as their former creditor, but as Michael's mother and Jessica's mother-in-law, roles that felt both familiar and entirely new. We worked together to arrange furniture, hang pictures, and transform their new house into a home where they could build the family life they'd been planning. That evening, as we sat on their new back patio sharing a bottle of champagne to celebrate their homeownership, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this moment. A year earlier, I'd been the excluded mother-in-law whose presence was considered an inconvenience to their social aspirations. Now I was their neighbor, their family member, and their trusted advisor on matters both personal and professional. To new beginnings, Jessica said, raising her glass. To honest relationships, Michael added. To family, I concluded, meaning it more completely than I ever had before. 6 months later, when Jessica called to tell me that they were expecting their first child, I was in my garden planting flowers that would bloom in time for the baby's arrival. The call came not with formal announcement, but with the casual intimacy of someone sharing news with a family member who was expected to be part of the child's life from the beginning. "We want you to know first," Jessica said, her voice carrying joy and excitement. "Before we tell anyone else, we wanted to share the news with the person who's going to be the most important grandmother this baby could have." As I hung up the phone and returned to my gardening, I thought about the unexpected paths that had led me to this moment. I'd built a business empire while maintaining the facade of a simple widow, excluded myself from family gatherings rather than challenge uncomfortable social dynamics, and nearly lost my relationship with my son because I'd been unwilling to reveal my authentic self. But sometimes the most painful revelations create the strongest foundations for what comes next. The family we were building now was more honest, more resilient, and more genuinely connected than anything we'd managed to create before the truth forced us to start over. The house next door was quiet as evening settled over Willowbrook Heights, but I could see lights in the windows where Michael and Jessica were probably discussing nursery plans and preparing for the changes that would reshape their lives once again. This time, those changes would include me not as an excluded observer but as an integral part of their family's story. After years of being banned from family dinners, I was finally home. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.